Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Education USA webinar. We're happy to have this opportunity today to discuss communication with professors. And we have a fantastic guest speaker from the University of Michigan, Flint. Ketrін Kolpart is the Global Outreach Coordinator at the International Center. Ketrін, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. This is such a pleasure, and I'm really excited about this topic. Thank you to the attendees who have come as well. I hope that you ask questions throughout the presentation as well as after. You may also follow up, of course, anytime via email after the presentation. So before I throw up my PowerPoint here, I would just like to give you a little more information about who I am and my background so that you know where my content and advice is coming from. So besides being an international student myself, some years ago in France and West Africa, where I studied French abroad, I've also been a teacher. I was an instructor for 6 years. I received my master's degree in TESOL, teaching English to speakers of other languages. And so I spent 1 year teaching high school in France. I taught 1 year at a university in Saudi Arabia. And then I taught for 4 years in the United States at 4 different universities, although one was a community college, and I've also taught French. So I've had many different settings in which I've been able to teach. And so much of the content and advice and the examples from my presentation come directly from the instructor perspective and experience. Now I am in my 2nd year of actually working as Global Outreach Coordinator, which means that I have the amazing opportunity to connect with students before they come to the classroom, such as yourselves in the US here, and do recruitment, marketing, outreach, work with alumni. It's such an interesting role where I get to interact with students still, but not in a teaching capacity anymore. Exactly. This to me is definitely still teaching, but a little bit different. So without further ado, I will put my PowerPoint on the screen for you to see. And please note, you are more than welcome to request a PDF version after the presentation. So to begin, the title is Communicating with Professors in an American University Setting. I wanted to clarify, by saying in an American university setting, since this information, of course, may not be applicable in Canada or Mexico or, our neighbors. So that picture, by the way, is of one of our faculty members, a professor from the Department of Africana Studies, meeting with our new international students at orientation. She was one of 8 professors here at the University of Michigan, Flint, who met with small groups right after this presentation so that students had a chance to actually ask professors immediately all of their questions after hearing everything I just shared with them during our workshop. And you can see from this table, we have great diversity. These students are from Nigeria, India, Kenya, Ethiopia, and Germany at this one table alone. We have about 300 international students at our school and from about 40 countries. So the diversity is pretty fantastic. So going back to the goals of this presentation and outcomes. First, communication must take into account the multiple facets of the American university experience and expectations. So I will be covering those different parts and giving examples immediately after of communication and interaction with a professor. So to help you understand why there are certain expectations regarding communication, we'll discuss these various classroom-related topics and how they connect to your interactions with professors in the US. So by the end of the presentation, you should be able to have a deeper understanding of those expectations and how they relate to communication within the US university setting in order to have positive and successful exchanges with your university professors here. These are those topics that I will be covering, everything from titles, punctuality, emails and Blackboard, which is a platform that we use at the University of Michigan Flint, and there are many universities who use Blackboard. But if they don't use Blackboard, they usually have something very similar where a lot of online classes take place, or just announcements, communications from your professor may go through Blackboard, assignments may be posted and submitted on Blackboard, discussion forums for you to connect more with your peers virtually, and so on. I'll also cover office hours, the syllabus, responsibility, respect and communication, and then we'll have, I think, plenty of time for question and answer. So far, so good? All right. Well, then we are going to take a look now in the classroom with titles. So I wanted to see about if you're able to text me. If you have questions, you can message them to me. I think they should pop up here, or raise your hand. I just want to make sure that my screen is good here. All right, so what do you call your professor? Is it as simple as you think? Do you just always call them professor, or is there more to it? So in Ukraine, for example, what would you call your teacher or instructor? Anybody? Well, then in the American university classroom, this is something many of our international students are surprised by. There is a spectrum of informal to formal and no one black and white rule. So until you are told otherwise, you should use the most formal titles, and that includes doctor or professor. Some instructors at American universities can teach with a master's degree, and in this case, you would use Mr., Miss, Mrs., or their first name if they ask you to use it. And that goes for both professors who have PhDs and instructors or lecturers who have master's degrees. It's very common in the United States at many universities for professors and lecturers to ask you to just use their first name. I went to, for my undergraduate degree, I got my bachelor's in French, and I'd say in at least 70% of my classes, professors asked for you to use their first name, or they would just introduce themselves with their first name, and then you take that as your cue to use moving forward. If they introduce themselves with I am professor or I am doctor, then that is what you use. In fact, one time I even emailed my professor to ask him what he preferred when he didn't really clarify during the first day of class. So it's okay to ask. It's important that you do not use teacher as a title or assume that you can use their first name if they seem quite informal, because you should be thinking about that first impression that you're making, and you want it, of course, to be positive. So in some countries, and I'm not sure about where you all are from, if it's common or not, but teacher is actually something very commonly used as a sign of respect, but here would actually be understood as something sort of disrespectful, since that is a general term to refer to instructors, professors, but not a title that we call somebody. So, sorry about the repetition there. It looks like the one last slide, using sir and ma'am, is another common question. Can I call my professor sir or ma'am? Should I be using that? How often should I be using that? And so on. Well, this is something that's actually interesting. In the United States, we have different regions, right? So we are Michigan, we are in the Midwest of the United States, where sir and ma'am are not very common. But if you use them, it's okay. It might just be seen as really very formal. So if you look at the South part of the United States, you know, Texas, Florida, Kentucky, sir and ma'am are expected. And so when you use them, it's considered normal, expected, not unusual, but here it would be seen as very, very formal. So there's no example after that first point, because that's more of an FYI for your information. And if you have any questions, please let me know. I forgot to mention my master's degree, and I'm currently getting my second master's degree, and I'd say at least 80 or 90% of my professors say their first name, and they're very okay with being informal. So second, I want to move on now to talk about punctuality. So what does that mean? You know, being on time, right? This meaning, what it means to be punctual or on time, differs or varies culture to culture. When I studied in Senegal in West Africa, time had a totally different meaning. It was very relaxed, very laid back. And if you were really late to something, it was no big deal. There are even expressions in some languages that kind of speak to this, where you aren't in trouble if you're late. It's almost expected that people will be late, but that might also be different depending on the context within that country. So I had some culture shock when I came to class and my professor was late the first day, but it wasn't considered that big of a deal. Here, however, in the United States, punctuality is considered very seriously. You may or may not have heard the expression "time is money," and Americans sometimes live by that. So we really appreciate, in general, when people are on time. But even better, as I note here, being early, especially in the university setting in the United States, it shows respect to your professors that you are arriving early and taking out your books and different items to be prepared for when class starts. So when it comes to communication, thinking about punctuality, what is something a student is most likely going to have to communicate with regard to punctuality? It's apologizing if they're tardy, which means late. And my advice, both from personal experience as well as many faculty members I've spoken with, professors, is to just keep it simple, keep it polite, and do not over-explain. I have had many students who write very long emails about why they're either going to be late or why they were late, and it's just not necessary. You can simply state that you were late, apologize, and make sure not to do it again. So for an example, with communicating, let's look at a scenario, an example. So you're a student who was late to class today. Now, class is over. You walk up to your professor to apologize. Have any of you ever done this? So we have student in blue. Professor, do you have a moment? Professor, sure, what's going on? Student, I just wanted to apologize for my tardiness today. I'll make sure it does not happen again. Professor, thank you for letting me know. So let's look at this just a little bit more in depth. The first sentence of "Professor, do you have a moment?" is important to notice. Rather than just walking up and immediately apologizing, we use their title to acknowledge them. You know, you're human, I see you. And second, asking if they have time rather than assuming, because often professors have another class they must go teach right after class. Other times they might have 7 students who want to talk to them, or they might have a meeting. So we are hyper conscious, very aware of that here in the United States, especially in the university setting with our busy professors. So you want to take a moment to, 1, use their title, and 2, acknowledge that busyness and request that they speak with you, even if it's just very briefly. And it's important to note that this could vary class to class, professor to professor. It could be quite different depending on your relationship with the professor. But let's assume that you don't know them well and you want to apologize. So you use their title, you ask if they could speak with you, and after they say, yeah, sure, what's going on? Let's look at that sentence. I just wanted to apologize for my tardiness today. I'll make sure it doesn't happen again. It's only 2 sentences. The student did not go into an elaborate explanation about how their dog ate their homework, or they had a fight with their mom on the phone, or they felt really sick and they go into detail about it. Nope, you don't need to do that. There's no need. And often, if you give too much information, actually, it can be perceived as overdoing it and possibly that you're lying. So when you use just, and then the past tense, the simple past, I just wanted, plus the verb, the infinitive, to apologize, this structure is very useful when you want to soften something, when you want to soften a request. I just wanted to ask if I could meet with you today, or even an apology. I just wanted to apologize. So it's less direct, which is something very appreciated here. Second, acknowledging your mistake. I'll make sure it doesn't happen again. So when you acknowledge that you owned your mistake, you're taking responsibility, you can save your impression. Let's say this was the first day of class, but you apologized just like this. I think most professors would really appreciate it, and that you kept it short. And especially if you do not come to class late again, it shows that you were serious and that you took it seriously and you are changing your behaviors to come to class to be on time. I wanted to give a second example of punctuality with an email, because as you know, it's very different when you're communicating in person, face-to-face. You have body language to think about, eye contact. How are you holding yourself? What about your tone of voice, your intonation when you ask a question? But an email is so much simpler, yet there are other things to consider. And I'll talk a little bit more about emails in a few minutes here. So here's the scenario. It's just in the past, right? You were late to class today, and class is now over, but you didn't have a chance to speak with your professor to apologize. Maybe they had to go right away. So you write an email. So let's look at this email. Dear Professor Simon, I just wanted to write a quick email to apologize for being late to class today. I will make sure it doesn't happen again. Sincerely, Katie. This email could look very different. There are dozens of ways that you could write it, but let's make sure we acknowledge every part of it, right? We have dear, some kind of greeting with their title and last name, a comma after the salutation. Next, we have the body or the message. And again, you see, I just wanted to write. Just, which softens it, makes it less direct. Wanted, the past tense. To write, the infinitive. Again, 2 sentences, just apologizing and letting them know it won't happen again. Sincerely, you could also say regards, thank you. There are many different ways to sign off on your communication, your email, and then your name. Although I do recommend you always put your first and last name and your student ID underneath your name. But again, this will also depend on your relationship with the professor. If it's a very small class and you know them first name basis, you probably do not need to put your last name. But I would really recommend it, especially at the beginning of a semester, or if you have a very large class and it's very difficult for your professor to keep track of maybe 50 or 100 students they have in that single class alone. So now, as I mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about emails in Blackboard. Please make sure you're asking questions. I don't see any yet, if you have any. We talked a little about what Blackboard is, and I really want to stress the importance of reading your emails at least once a day. I've found that many international students have an adjustment to make with this because they may not have ever received as many emails as when they come to university. And that goes for probably anywhere that they study, but especially I think in an American university, our main method of communication is email, even if texting or WhatsApp or Facebook messaging, so Instagram is your preferred method, the university is going to be communicating via email and Blackboard or whatever equivalent that they may have. Ideally, best practice, if you're not really strong with your emails, is to check at least once in the morning and once at night, because professors will often send communications, emails about homework, updates on assignments, updates on grading, requests. Sometimes they have to change the schedule. Sometimes something is last minute. And professors will generally give you at least, a full day notice if there is a change that affects you. But at the end of the day, not seeing an email is not an excuse. And I put this here because it's a very, very common excuse that we hear from students, which is, oh, I didn't see the email that said the classroom changed to another building. I didn't see the email that assigned us a new homework assignment. It's not an excuse. And if you did miss the email, what should you do? You should apologize. And you can do that in person, or you can write an email. And in that email, you may need to request that you have an extension for that assignment, or you may request to redo a quiz. But you should also check the syllabus to make sure there isn't already a policy about that, which there often is. And I'll talk more about a syllabus in just a moment here. So when sending an email, remember, here's a good checklist, and we just saw a good example. Have a specific subject in your subject line, a greeting with both a title and name, a body, the message, which is concise, short, and specific. So if you request a meeting, make sure you give a date and time and don't just keep it open if you don't have to. Include your name and student ID, and be mindful of your language. No texting language. And this, for some of you or all of you, it may seem obvious, but we see so many emails where texting language is used, both in here in our office, and it's not just with international students, it's with our domestic students as well, but also in the classroom with professors. I have 6 years of teaching experience, and every semester I taught, there was always, texting language. Instead of Y-O-U for you, we would see the letter U. And instead of R-A-R-E, we would see the letter R. And that is not making a good impression, and it's not the appropriate context to be using informal language like that. You should really be using standard academic English. Finally, of course, respect and politeness. It may seem obvious, but again, remember how culturally respect and politeness can change. And so it's important to be aware of these differences by asking questions, doing what you're doing now, attending a webinar to learn about some of these things, and making sure to be open-minded and flexible to change when you do learn about how something might be different here versus back home. So my example with communicating with an email, this is a very common question. The scenario is, you have a question about your class textbook before class starts. This is because often the price of a textbook is very high, but if you buy it used versus new, you can save a lot of money. But sometimes you have to pay extra for a course pack or a key that can only come with a new book. So let's look at this example. Dear Professor Lawrence, my name is Catherine, and I will be a student in your EIM for 545 class this upcoming semester. I'm writing because I wanted to clarify if we needed to purchase a new copy of the textbook in order to have the access code, or if a used copy would be okay. Thank you in advance, and I look forward to meeting you in class. Regards, Ketrін Kolpart. So here I did a better job because I included my full name. So let's break this down. First, we have our title, our greeting, dear, our title, and the last name. I made sure that I introduced myself because this is before class starts, obviously. I should have also put my student ID at the end. I mentioned which class that I would be in, since this professor is probably teaching multiple classes. And then here, I want you to notice I'm writing because. This is, do you know what verb tense? It is the present progressive, right? So it's happening now. I'm writing because I wanted to clarify. Again, we see I wanted to. So past of want, and then infinitive. I wanted to clarify. I wanted to request. I wanted to ask. I wanted to know, and then whatever your request is. So I ask my question. I'm specific about new or used, about the code, and then I make sure to thank them. Don't forget this part. It might seem very simple, but professors have very busy lives, often kind of stressful. They have many assignments to grade, and they're also producing research on the side. They're also engaged in literature, writing articles. Sometimes they're even managing programs, working with admissions. They have a full plate. So thank them for their time, and make sure that you have your sign-off, regards, sincerely, respectfully, depending on the formality of the relationship, and then space, your name. Next, office hours. You guys know what office hours is? Here, we have time that is set aside for students, like many universities around the world. They're for both walk-ins, so without an appointment, and also for appointments with a professor. You can always find the office hours on the syllabus. So it might say Monday and Wednesday from 9 to 11, for example. When possible, I definitely advise making an appointment. This way you can be prepared. The professor knows what you want to talk about, and maybe they can even do some preparation on their end if needed, depending on the question or request. Take advantage of office hours, please. This is time set aside for students to ask questions about anything, to ask questions about homework, assignments, the course content, some concept that you may not be grasping or understanding. Maybe there's even a conflict in class with one of your peers, with another student. Or maybe, and this is very common, you're struggling. Maybe between, adjusting to a new culture and this really challenging class and missing your family, you're struggling and you feel like you need some help and you want to talk to your professor about what these struggles are so that they can help you. This is actually something our international students find to be different. For a lot of times back home, they would never go to office hours for a professor to talk about maybe some personal issues and how they are affecting the academic issues. But here, it's expected that if you're struggling to communicate the struggle both to professors and people like us here in the International Center, the staff who are here to support you before, during, and after your studies to make sure that you are healthy, happy, academically successful, and so on. So a good example of this is we had a student come for a graduate program here from some overseas country, of course. I won't name any details, but she didn't grow up learning about American history, of course, because she's not from the US. But the class she was taking required a base knowledge of American history. So after we talked to her, we encouraged her to go to office hours with this teacher regularly and make sure it was okay to meet weekly for the first month or two of class to catch up, because it was very specific information that this professor could help her with so that she was successful with her assignments and understanding the base knowledge she needed. So that said, she not only did that and took advantage of it after our encouraging her to do so, she got a 4.0, a perfect score in her first semester. And after one semester in graduate programs here, you can apply to even more scholarships. And she received 3 scholarships that paid for almost 1 full year of tuition. Almost the entire tuition cost was covered just because she had a 4.0, perfect grade, as well as an essay that she wrote and a recommendation letter from one professor and myself. She also works here in our office. So moving on, the communication piece for office hours, the email example. The scenario is you simply want to request a meeting during office hours. So do you remember all of the different parts of an email that we should have here? Let's start with the greeting. Dear Professor Lawrence, I hope this email finds you well. I'm writing to ask if I may set up a meeting with you during your office hours this Thursday from 1 to 2 p.m. to discuss the last essay assignment. Can you confirm if that works for you? Thank you, Ketrін Kolpart. So do I have everything here from that checklist we talked about? I hope so. I see that I've got my title, I've got the greeting. I hope this email finds you well is a nice expression, especially if maybe you haven't ever spoken to the professor or you haven't spoken in a long time. It's just a well wish that, I hope you're doing okay, kind of acknowledging that humanity before diving into the request. Again, next we see I'm writing to ask. Do you remember what verb tense this was? It's the present progressive. I am writing, and then that's followed by to ask, the infinitive. And then if, continue. Was I specific in this email? I would say yes, because I asked about office hours. The day, Thursday, was given, and the time, 1 to 2 p.m. And then I made sure to ask the question, can you confirm if that works for you? And then I have my sign off, thank you. And then I have my name, and of course, if needed, your student ID. I really strongly advise you to practice all of these yourself after the webinar, and you can even create new scenarios that you think you will encounter and practice writing those emails and sharing them with your peers or maybe talking to people at Education USA to help you improve those skills. Of course, you may always follow up with me as well. You can practice with us. Next, I'd like to move on to the syllabus. First of all, do you all know what a syllabus is? I hope so. The syllabus is the course description, calendar, outlines your classes, requirements, textbooks, policies, rules, procedures, everything, right? So here in the US at American universities, these are taken very seriously because they are essentially, they're there to protect both the student and the professor. So that if you have a question about any of these things, you can go to this document and find the answer. But what if it's not there? You can write an email or you can speak to your professor after class, and we'll see an example here in just a moment. It is your responsibility as the student to understand the syllabus. And the vast majority of professors, I think, in the United States spend significant time reviewing every part of the syllabus, because in the end, it will save you time and it will save the professor time from asking a lot of unnecessary questions. And so that's why it's extremely important to consult the syllabus before asking your professor a question. This goes back to what I said earlier about making a strong first positive impression. If you immediately ask a question about when is the next homework assignment due to your professor, and it's written here on the syllabus, well, what are you communicating to your professor by doing that? You're possibly communicating that you're not focused or paying attention, you're being disrespectful by having heard the syllabus during class, but not remembering or paying attention or forgetting and not looking. There are many ways that could be interpreted negatively. So this for me, as a teacher for 6 years at 4 different universities, both abroad and in the United States, was one of the biggest frustrations when we would get 10 emails a week with a question that could be answered by what is written in the syllabus. So I don't want to scare anybody. I don't want to scare any students about the syllabus or asking their professor questions. But my main point here is take the time to go through it, maybe before class, which often is possible. For example, here at U of M Flint, you can download your syllabus from Blackboard and review it in depth before class starts. And then when you go to class, your professor will always review it and take questions right after. So you should ask your questions during class if possible. But what happens if you have a question that is not answered by the syllabus and class is over and you're at home? Well, let's take a look at an example here. Again, writing to Professor Lawrence, because we have a question about the syllabus that is not answered in the syllabus. So what can we do? I'm writing because I have a question about our upcoming assignment. I noticed that in the syllabus, the length of the essay was not included. So I was hoping you might be able to clarify that point for me, and I apologize, if I may have missed this somewhere in class or elsewhere. Thank you, Ketrін Kolpart. So you can see I should review my email before I send it because I accidentally put apologize. It should be apologize. So always review your email. It's a really good point, actually. Sometimes we make spelling or grammatical mistakes that are even, that may even make it confusing to the professor, which we do not want. So we have our greeting, we have the title, we have the name. I'm writing because, okay, we have that present progressive again, and then the question about the assignment. Again, be specific. Hopefully, if this was a real email, I would say assignment number 1 about the history of entrepreneurship, or for example, that's my class I'm taking this semester. But here is the most important thing, right? I'm acknowledging that I looked at the syllabus first to try to find the answer, and that I didn't just directly go to the professor. And I specifically noted the question I had, the length. How many pages should it be? How many words should it be? So I was hoping you might be able to clarify that point for me. You notice here I'm using the past progressive. I was hoping you might be able to clarify. Might be able. You're using modal verbs, right? Might, because that again softens the request, or it sort of softens the language. It's less direct, the more modal verbs. You guys know modal verbs? Can, could, might, would. So there's that spectrum of modal verbs you can use. But here's the last piece I want to point out. I apologize if I may have missed something. So I'm saying sorry in advance if I actually missed something because maybe the professor did say something in class about it and asked us to write it down. But if I'm texting on my phone, I'm not going to hear that, am I? So it's a nice thing to include just in case that he did say it, because what if he replies and he's like, hi, Katie, hi, Catherine. Yes, I did state it during class, but thank you for following up. You know, this email is very polite and it's certainly not going to upset or frustrate, I think, any professor. So we're almost to the end here. I want to just speak briefly about responsibility because it looks different culture to culture. Here, in an academic setting in the United States, you as the students are in charge of your own actions. I mention this because many cultures have different maybe family scenarios or situations where the student receives a lot of support or a lot of assistance with something that may not happen in the United States. It depends on the school, it depends on the resources, and we have plenty of facilities here, for example, that help students. But at the end of the day, when it comes to going to class, being on time, communicating appropriately, and owning your mistakes, apologizing, that's on the students. That's always on the students. And you can't point to anybody else or blame anybody else for your actions. So my advice to you is own your mistakes, acknowledge them, accept them, learn from them, and move on. Don't take it too personally. Don't let it ruin your day or your semester. Just learn from it. So for example, if you make a mistake, for example, you misunderstood the syllabus or you forgot to set your alarm and missed class, be honest about it and own the mistake and communicate it. So I think we've talked a little bit about respect. This is a question I had about when I do this with students in person. I ask back home, how would you request a meeting with your instructor or professor, and how would you apologize for a mistake? But this is where I want to highlight something. Speech acts, they look and sound different here, of course. They look and sound different there. All around the world, when you request something, apologize, thank, interrupt, email, and so on, these are things where each time you experience them in a new context, there's going to be something that makes you feel uncomfortable, or you make a mistake because you didn't know about it. And that ties to what I just talked about with just, okay, now I know. Move on and adapt. So the final example with regard to respect and communication and speech acts, because a speech act doesn't just include the words you say, it's how you say it. It's how you present yourself with body language, and it's the words, of course, as well. So finally, we're going to look at this speech act of both disagreeing, which is an act, and requesting, which we've seen before. So this example is, Dear Professor Smith, this is Katie from your English 101 class. I just received the feedback on my last assignment and had some questions about the scoring. Would you have some time soon after class or during office hours to discuss it? I really appreciate your time. Best, Ketrін Kolpart. So again, we have the greeting, dear, title, professor, name, Smith, comma, next space, introduction, who are you, what class is it, and then the actual body here. I got my feedback, but I have questions, and this is part of disagreeing because in person, when you meet, you will have to respectfully explain why you disagreed with the scoring if you ever find yourself in that situation, which happens actually quite a lot. Would you have some time? So that modal verb, right? Not necessarily do you have some time, but would you have some time is even more polite on the spectrum. After class or during office hours. So in this email, I wasn't specific about any particular office hour, day, or time, but I'm giving the professor a chance to choose. Because sometimes, if it's especially a busy professor, they may have a preference to talk quickly after class, or they might be too busy and they might have to wait 1 week to talk to you during office hours. Finally, I say I really appreciate your time, again, to acknowledge the help that you are going to receive. It's basically saying thank you, which we've talked about before. Best, our sign-off, and my name. So I went a little bit over my 30-minute. I wanted to talk for about half an hour and then have a lot of time for questions. But before I forget, this is my contact information, my email, my personal office phone number, if you'd like to call me directly to speak, our university location, email, and ways to connect with us if you are interested in learning more about the University of Michigan-Flint. We're on Facebook, Skype, Instagram, WhatsApp, which the phone number is listed here, Twitter, and you can request anytime to talk to me, any of our staff. And we have 7 international student ambassadors from India, Nepal, Saudi Arabia, all around the world. And they're here to answer your questions about what life is like as a student in the United States, whether they're general, like this presentation, or specific about our university. So without further ado, I would love to take some questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for the presentation. There's a question in the chat box, and we also have several people in the center. So if they have any questions, that maybe they will just speak up. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, sure. I'm sorry I missed the chat. I think I must be.
So the question in the chat is whether it is appropriate to start an email with "Hello, Professor."
Great question. Hello, Professor. I think it's okay. I think that hello is a great greeting. Professor is, of course, formal. I would just suggest that you learn their last name or look it up in the syllabus and include it, so it's more personalized. What else can I answer? I'm sorry, let me get to the chat here. There it is.
Doesn't seem to be any questions in the room, at least.
I can also ask some questions to them that may generate some questions if needed.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
So because I've never been to Ukraine yet. I've been to over 30 countries now in my 30 years and 20 for work, but I've not yet been to Ukraine. Is there anything that stood out during the presentation that was really quite surprising or different from what expectations are in an academic setting, whether in high school or university in Ukraine? Oh, yeah. You're able to graduate. Your
Okay, give me a sec.
Of course.
Вопрос в том, если что вы заметили из различий между тем, что она говорила в презентации, профессиональной штрафой по отношению к коммуникации в Украине. So we have one of the participants here who's saying that it looks like in the States it's a little bit more formal. In
more formal. Okay.
All the different ways how you can engage with the professor.
Okay, interesting. It's actually different feedback than we see because most, I guess most of the surprise comments we get are, I'm so surprised how informal my professor is with one-on-one discussions, casual discussions, using first names, meeting outside of class, mentoring. But it's true. For this presentation, I do focus on the more formal scenarios because I think there are higher stakes with that. Meaning, if you don't use the formal language when you really should have, it may hurt the relationship and cause make a negative impression or offend the instructor. So it's a good point to bring up. I'm glad it came up just because all of the examples here, I think, should be the way you start, but you should be ready to adapt and maybe change the way you communicate based on the feedback you get from that interaction. So if you call your professor, hey, Professor Simon, oh, call me Mark. Well, obviously, you should call your professor Mark now. If you write a really formal email, but then the response is, like some of my professors will give a very short response. They won't include a title. They won't necessarily, maybe there's even mistakes in it. Well, okay, that tells me that with this professor, the more information I get based on these experiences, the more maybe I can adjust how I communicate to meet them kind of at the same level. Because one thing I find that has been true in higher education in the US for more than 10 years is the power differentiation between professor and student is no longer like this, but has really come to be more of, we're on the same level as people. We each have different backgrounds, but we each have knowledge the other person doesn't have. Meaning the perspective of thinking like, oh, students are blank canvases, empty slates for professors to teach and put all their information in. It's no longer like that as much as it used to be. However, the diversity among professors in the US is great. Meaning we had 7 professors come to our international student orientation to speak with students after this presentation, and only 2 were American. We had one from Nigeria, one from India, one from Jordan, I actually stood in, so there were 3 Americans because one didn't show up, and another Nigerian. So this is universal, like a universal truth about American universities, because they attract the top talent, right? So you're going to have people from all over the world competing for these positions, and it's a really, really great advantage for students studying at a school to get exposure from professors from all of those different backgrounds. However, to a certain extent, they must all conform to have the same expectations regarding syllabus and running their classroom, but they will each have a variation in how they communicate and their preferences. So that might be the biggest takeaway, is be open-minded for this to be your starting point, but for everything to eventually be different depending on the relationship. That was kind of a long comment, sorry about that.
Sounds real great to me. Thank you so much for that contribution.
Sure. Does anybody thought of anything?
There doesn't seem to be any more questions. So I guess at this point, I just have to thank you very much for the time you've taken to engage with our students. We really appreciate your time, your effort, and the content you brought to this conversation. It was really a great presentation.
Thank you so much. Thanks again for having me. And if you have any follow-up questions, don't hesitate to reach out.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.